December 1944. Beneath the frozen Ardennes forest, 40 wounded American soldiers waited for death in a collapsing aid station, while German patrols systematically cleared every bunker within 2 kilometers. Their medic, Corporal James McKinley from rural Kansas, had discovered something the Wehrmacht training manuals never anticipated. Blood doesn't just save lives through transfusion. Sometimes it deceives armies. December 16th, 1944, 06:47 hours. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Temperature, -12 degrees Celsius. The first German shells struck the 99th Infantry Division's forward aid station at precisely 06:47 hours, transforming Corporal James McKinley's morning routine into chaos. The 24-year-old medic from Russell Springs, Kansas, had been organizing plasma bags when the explosions collapsed the eastern wall, burying 3 wounded soldiers under frozen timber and dirt. The temperature was -12 degrees. McKinley could taste cordite. His hands were already numb. The Wehrmacht's winter offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, had begun with overwhelming force. Within 3 hours, German armored divisions had shattered American defensive lines across an 80-kilometer front. Communications were destroyed, supply routes severed. The aid station, a reinforced bunker system originally constructed by Belgian forces in 1940, suddenly found itself 5 kilometers behind enemy lines with 47 wounded soldiers, 6 medics, and Captain Robert Chen, a surgeon from San Francisco who had performed 19 consecutive operations without sleep. McKinley understood their situation with brutal clarity. The Wehrmacht was conducting methodical clearance operations, systematically checking every structure, every bunker, every possible hiding place for isolated American forces. German doctrine was precise and unforgiving. They would find the aid station. It was mathematically inevitable. The bunker system consisted of 3 interconnected underground chambers connected by narrow tunnels. The main chamber housed the operating area where Captain Chen worked under failing kerosene lamps. The eastern chamber, now partially collapsed, contained ammunition and medical supplies. The western chamber held the wounded waiting for evacuation that would never arrive. The air smelled of blood, antiseptic, gangrene, and the sharp mineral scent of frozen earth. By 09:15 hours, the situation had become catastrophic. Captain Chen informed McKinley that 14 wounded soldiers required immediate evacuation or they would die within 24 hours. Blood loss was the primary killer. The aid station's entire supply of plasma had been exhausted 3 days earlier. Type O negative blood, the universal donor type, was gone. The refrigeration unit for whole blood storage had failed when generators ran out of fuel. Soldiers were dying not from enemy action but from the simple absence of blood volume in their bodies. McKinley had trained at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, where instructors emphasized doctrine, proper storage, correct typing, precise transfusion protocols. Everything by the manual. Everything documented, everything approved by military medical bureaucracy that assumed you would always have supplies, always have power, always have time. The protocols were useless now. At 11:30 hours, the first German patrol passed within 300 meters of the bunker's concealed entrance. McKinley counted 14 soldiers through the observation slit, moving in textbook formation, checking terrain features with systematic thoroughness. They carried the new Sturmgewehr assault rifles. Their uniforms were winter camouflage. These were not exhausted conscripts. These were experienced infantry conducting professional military operations. The wounded soldiers understood what German discovery meant. Wounded American prisoners were frequently shot during the Ardennes offensive when German forces lacked resources for POW management. McKinley had seen the bodies. Everyone had. The rule was unspoken but absolute. If captured while wounded and unable to march, you were executed to prevent slowing the German advance. By 14 hours, McKinley had witnessed 3 more soldiers die from hemorrhagic shock, the medical term for bleeding to death when blood volume drops too low for the heart to pump effectively. Their bodies were placed in the collapsed eastern chamber because the ground was too frozen for burial. Private David Morrison from Oklahoma died holding a photograph of his wife. Sergeant Paul Kowalski from Detroit died asking McKinley to tell his mother he had been brave. Technical Sergeant Michael Rodriguez from Los Angeles died unconscious, never knowing the morphine had run out hours earlier. Captain Chen pulled McKinley aside at 16:45 hours, his voice professionally calm despite 47 hours without sleep. "Corporal, we're going to lose 14 more men tonight unless we find blood. I can perform the transfusions. I can keep them stable, but I need blood volume. Without it, surgery is just delaying death." McKinley asked the question everyone already knew. Could they use blood from the less severely wounded to transfuse the critical cases? Captain Chen explained the mathematics of despair. Extracting enough blood to save 14 men would require weakening 28 donors to dangerous levels in sub-freezing temperatures with inadequate nutrition. You would trade 14 deaths for potentially 42. At 18:30 hours, as darkness fell across the Ardennes, McKinley made 3 observations that doctrine had never prepared him for. First, the abandoned Belgian military facility contained a second bunker system 40 meters northwest, partially collapsed and obviously empty, visible from the forest approach routes. Second, the German patrols were following logical search patterns, checking structures from north to south with mathematical precision. Third, human blood, when exposed to sub-freezing temperatures, does not freeze immediately. It forms distinctive patterns on snow that are visible from considerable distances, patterns that tell stories to anyone trained to read them. McKinley's idea formed not as inspiration, but as desperate calculation. German forces were systematically clearing bunkers. They had probably already marked the abandoned Belgian structure on their tactical maps. They would search it, eventually. When they found nothing, doctrine dictated they would mark it cleared and move to the next grid square. But if they found something that suggested recent American presence, something that suggested wounded had been evacuated hours earlier, they might not return to search more carefully. They might assume the Americans had already retreated. The question was how to make them believe the wrong bunker had recently held wounded Americans without actually exposing the 47 men still hidden in the real aid station. McKinley needed evidence convincing enough to deceive professional German infantry, evidence that would survive scrutiny, evidence that would redirect the search away from the actual location. At 19:15 hours, McKinley approached Captain Chen with a proposal that sounded insane. They would deliberately create what appeared to be an abandoned American aid station in the collapsed Belgian bunker, using their most precious and irreplaceable resource as bait: human blood. Not enough to weaken the wounded, just enough to deceive an army. December 16, 1944, 21 hours, Ardennes Forest. Visibility 30 meters, temperature -14 degrees Celsius. Captain Chen stared at McKinley for 17 seconds before responding. The surgeon's exhaustion was visible in every line of his face, but his mind remained sharp. "Corporal, you're proposing we deliberately waste blood, our most critical resource, to create a deception that might not work, gambling 47 lives on the hope that German infantry will make assumptions we cannot control." McKinley had expected resistance. Army doctrine did not accommodate improvisation this radical. But the alternative was clear. German forces would find them, probably within the next 12 hours, and everyone would die. The deception had to be perfect. The blood had to tell a story convincing enough that experienced Wehrmacht soldiers would believe they had missed the Americans by hours, not meters. The implementation began at 20:30 hours. McKinley selected 6 soldiers with minor wounds who could move without assistance. Private Thomas Bennett from Ohio, age 19, had shrapnel in his shoulder. Corporal William Foster from Tennessee, age 22, had a broken arm. Private First Class Anthony DeLuca from New York, age 20, had sustained a concussion but remained functional. Corporal James Hartley from Georgia, aged 23, had suffered burns on his hands. Private Robert Chen, no relation to the captain, from California, aged 21, had a bayonet wound in his thigh that had clotted properly. Sergeant First Class Edward Murphy from Massachusetts, aged 28, had taken a bullet through his left foot. Each man understood the stakes. McKinley explained the plan with brutal honesty. They would infiltrate the abandoned Belgian bunker, create evidence of recent American medical activity using blood from the plasma bags that had spoiled when refrigeration failed, arrange equipment to suggest hasty evacuation, and establish trails suggesting wounded had been moved northwest toward American lines. The operation would take approximately 90 minutes. If German patrols detected them, they would almost certainly be killed. McKinley's team moved through the frozen forest at 21 hours, carrying equipment scavenged from the real aid station. 3 damaged stretchers, 2 empty ammunition crates, bandages deliberately soaked in spoiled plasma, medical instruments too damaged for continued use, empty morphine syringes, and 4 collection bags containing approximately 2 liters of blood, not from wounded soldiers, but from the 3 men who had died that afternoon. McKinley had collected it immediately after death, before coagulation made it unusable for the deception. The abandoned Belgian bunker was partially collapsed, its entrance concealed by fallen timber, but still accessible. The interior chamber was approximately 6 meters by 4 meters, with a ceiling that had partially caved in during some previous bombardment. The temperature inside was -11 degrees, slightly warmer than outside, but still well below freezing. Ice crystals covered every surface. The air smelled of mold and old explosives. McKinley directed the operation with precision learned from 18 months of combat medical service across North Africa, Sicily, and now Belgium. The blood was strategically distributed to tell a specific narrative. Approximately 400 milliliters were poured near what would serve as an operating area, creating a pool that would freeze into recognizable medical context, the kind of blood loss associated with surgery, not combat wounds. Another 300 milliliters were distributed in smaller quantities across the floor, simulating the chaotic movement of multiple wounded being treated simultaneously. The key deception involved the evacuation trails. McKinley ordered his team to create drag marks in the snow, leading from the bunker entrance toward the northwest, as if wounded on stretchers had been pulled through the forest. Blood was carefully dripped along these trails at intervals that suggested wounded men bleeding through bandages during transport. The spacing was critical. Too much blood would suggest fatally wounded men who couldn't survive evacuation. Too little would suggest minor wounds that wouldn't justify abandoning the bunker. McKinley calculated approximately 15 milliliters every 3 meters, enough to be clearly visible but consistent with successfully evacuated casualties. The equipment was arranged to suggest hasty but organized withdrawal. The stretchers were left partially buried in snow, positioned as if abandoned when soldiers shifted wounded to alternative carrying methods. The ammunition crates were left open, empty, consistent with supplies being distributed before evacuation. Bandages were scattered near the blood pools, some partially buried, suggesting they had been dropped during the chaos of treating multiple wounded simultaneously. The most critical element was temporal. The deception had to suggest the bunker had been abandoned approximately 4 to 6 hours earlier, recent enough that blood was still visible, but old enough that pursuit would seem futile. McKinley studied the blood's freezing patterns carefully. At -11 degrees, blood would begin to coagulate and darken within 45 minutes, would lose its bright red color within 90 minutes, and would freeze completely within 3 to 4 hours. The timing was nearly perfect. At 22:30 hours, McKinley's team completed the final touches. Dog tags from Private Morrison, one of the men who had died, were deliberately left near the operating area, as if dropped during frantic surgery. A damaged field jacket with clear unit markings was left hanging on exposed timber, suggesting someone had discarded it while working. A medic's bag, deliberately ripped and emptied, was positioned near the entrance. The team withdrew at 22:47 hours, carefully obscuring their actual approach and departure routes, while maintaining the northwest evacuation trails that pointed away from the real aid station. McKinley took one final look at their work. From a German soldier's perspective, the abandoned Belgian bunker now told a clear story. American medics had established a temporary aid station here, had treated multiple wounded for several hours, and had evacuated northwest approximately 4 to 6 hours earlier when German advance made the position untenable. The team returned to the real aid station at 23:35 hours, frozen and exhausted. Captain Chen examined McKinley's frostbitten hands and asked the only question that mattered: will it work? McKinley could only answer with honesty. If they search that bunker first, if they believe the timing, if they assume we retreated according to doctrine, and if they're under enough pressure to clear grid squares quickly, then yes, it might work. If any of those assumptions fail, we've wasted 2 liters of blood and 90 minutes we can't recover. The waiting began. German patrols were active throughout the night, their movements audible through the frozen forest. At 02:15 hours, voices were clearly heard within 100 meters. At 04:30 hours, flashlight beams swept across the forest within 50 meters of the real bunker's concealed entrance. At 06 hours, as dawn broke across the Ardennes on December 17th, McKinley heard the unmistakable sound of German soldiers discovering the abandoned Belgian bunker 40 meters away. He heard shouts. He heard commands. And then, most remarkably, he heard them move away toward the northwest, following the false trails his team had created 8 hours earlier. December 17th, 1944. 09:30 hours, German Wehrmacht command post 2 kilometers south of the aid station. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division stared at the intelligence report with growing frustration. His company had been assigned a 6-square-kilometer search sector, with orders to locate and eliminate isolated American forces that had been cut off during the offensive's initial breakthrough. Wehrmacht doctrine was precise. Systematic grid-by-grid clearance, careful documentation, immediate reporting of enemy contact. Weber had executed these procedures flawlessly across 3 campaigns. The Ardennes should have been no different, but the Americans were not behaving according to pattern. The abandoned bunker discovered at 06 hours told a story that made tactical sense. Wounded Americans had established a temporary aid station in a pre-existing Belgian fortification, had operated there for several hours treating casualties, and had evacuated northwest when German advance became inevitable. The blood evidence was conclusive. Multiple casualties, recent surgery, organized withdrawal. The equipment left behind was consistent with hasty but disciplined evacuation under enemy pressure. Weber had ordered his best tracker, Unteroffizier Hans Schneider from Bavaria, to analyze the site. Schneider's report confirmed the initial assessment. Approximately 15 to 20 American soldiers, including multiple wounded, had evacuated between 4 and 8 hours before discovery, moving northwest toward what they presumably believed were still American-held positions. The blood trails were clear. The timeline made sense. The direction was logical, given American defensive doctrine that emphasized withdrawal toward friendly lines when positions became untenable. What frustrated Weber was the timing. If his forces had arrived 4 hours earlier, they would have captured the entire group. The Americans had evacuated with almost perfect timing, suggesting either exceptional luck or sophisticated intelligence about German patrol schedules. Weber suspected the latter. American forces in the Ardennes had demonstrated surprising tactical awareness despite the chaos of the initial assault. The German infantry search pattern had been carefully planned. Weber's company was moving south to north, clearing each grid square systematically before advancing. The abandoned bunker had been in grid square designated Sector Charlie 7. With that location now cleared and documented, Weber's forces moved northwest into Sector Charlie 8, following the evacuation trails, while simultaneously continuing the systematic grid clearance that Wehrmacht doctrine demanded. At 11:45 hours, Weber's patrols found additional evidence that seemed to confirm the intelligence assessment. Approximately 800 meters northwest of the abandoned bunker, soldiers discovered bandages and medical supplies partially buried in snow, consistent with American forces discarding weight during a forced march with wounded. The discovery seemed to validate the pursuit direction. What Weber couldn't see, and what his doctrine couldn't anticipate, was that American medic 40 meters away had deliberately created a narrative designed to exploit German military thoroughness. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed that evidence discovered would be authentic, that blood trails represented actual wounded movement, that equipment abandonment reflected genuine operational decisions. The possibility that Americans would deliberately waste precious medical resources to create a deception was not considered within German operational planning frameworks. The doctrinal blindness had multiple dimensions. First, German military culture emphasized efficiency and resource conservation. The idea that Americans would deliberately pour liters of blood, an irreplaceable medical resource, into snow to create false trails contradicted fundamental assumptions about rational military behavior. Second, Wehrmacht search protocols assumed that systematic thoroughness would eventually locate all enemy forces. The doctrine did not adequately account for deception operations that redirected systematic searches away from actual positions while appearing to confirm the search methodology's effectiveness. Third, German commanders were under extreme time pressure to clear sectors quickly and advance the offensive timetable. This pressure created incentive to accept evidence that suggested Americans had already retreated, rather than conducting prolonged searches that would delay advance schedules. At 14:30 hours, Weber received new orders from division headquarters. The search sector was being reassigned. His company was needed to support the advance toward the Meuse River crossings, where American resistance had proven stronger than anticipated. The abandoned bunker in Sector Charlie 7 was marked on tactical maps as cleared, enemy evacuated 16 DC northwest. No further search was warranted. The grid square was officially categorized as secure. Weber never learned that 47 American soldiers were hidden 40 meters from the bunker his men had searched, that a 24-year-old medic from Kansas had created the entire scenario, or that the blood his tracker had analyzed came from dead soldiers whose final contribution to the war was posthumous deception that saved their comrades. The tactical maps circulated through German units over the next 24 hours, each showing Sector Charlie 7 marked as cleared. On December 18th, a second German patrol passed through the area, this time from a different unit conducting route reconnaissance. They discovered the same abandoned bunker, now 48 hours old. The blood was completely frozen. The trails were partially obscured by new snowfall, but the tactical maps showed the location had already been searched and cleared. Wehrmacht efficiency meant not wasting resources researching positions already documented as empty. The second patrol passed within 30 meters of the real aid station. They never stopped to search. The maps had already told them everything they needed to know. The Americans had evacuated 2 days earlier. The sector was clear. The patrol moved on, documenting their route and continuing their reconnaissance mission toward objectives 15 kilometers west. Inside the concealed aid station, McKinley listened to German voices fade into the distance for the second time. Captain Chen, who had been preparing for a last-stand defense with 3 functional rifles and 11 rounds of ammunition, slowly lowered his weapon. Private Bennett from Ohio, who had helped create the deception 36 hours earlier, whispered a question everyone was thinking. Did they just leave again? McKinley could only nod. The deception had worked not once but twice. Wehrmacht doctrine, Systematic German military thoroughness and time pressure had combined to create a blind spot exactly 40 meters wide. The dumb blood trick, so simple it seemed foolish, so desperate it seemed futile, had deceived one of the most professional military forces in human history. December 22nd, 1944, 11:15 hours, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The American counterattack reached McKinley's position on December 22nd, 6 days after the Wehrmacht offensive had trapped them behind enemy lines. Elements of the 2nd Armored Division, pushing eastward to blunt the German advance, discovered the concealed aid station through radio signals that had finally been restored when a damaged transmitter was repaired using scavenged parts from destroyed vehicles. Captain Richard Foster, of the 2nd Armored Division, approaching the bunker with infantry support, initially suspected a German trap. The position was too perfect, too well concealed, too precisely located in terrain that should have been thoroughly searched by Wehrmacht forces days earlier. Only when Captain Chen emerged under white flag, followed by 43 walking wounded and 4 soldiers on stretchers, did Foster comprehend what he was witnessing. The final statistics were both stark and remarkable. Of the 47 wounded Americans trapped on December 16th, 43 survived to liberation. 4 had died during the 6-day period, a mortality rate of 8.5% in a combat aid station with no resupply, no evacuation capability, no electricity, minimal medical supplies, and enemy forces conducting active search operations within meters of their position. Standard combat medical doctrine predicted mortality rates exceeding 60% under such conditions. When Captain Foster demanded to know how German forces had failed to discover them despite systematic searches, McKinley produced the salvaged patrol maps, now marked with German tactical symbols showing the abandoned Belgian bunker as cleared. He explained the deception with characteristic Kansas understatement. "We created a fake aid station using blood from dead soldiers to make the Germans think we'd evacuated hours before they arrived. They searched that bunker twice, believed the evidence both times, and marked it cleared on their maps. After that, they stopped looking." Foster's after-action report, filed December 23rd, characterized McKinley's deception as an unprecedented tactical medical deception operation utilizing minimal resources to achieve strategic effect disproportionate to operational investment. The report noted that 2 liters of otherwise unusable blood and 90 minutes of preparation had protected 47 soldiers for 6 days against one of the Wehrmacht's most aggressive divisional searches of the entire Ardennes offensive. The strategic implications became clear as intelligence officers analyzed captured German documents. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division had documented searching Sector Charlie 7, had marked it cleared, and had transmitted that information through normal Wehrmacht reporting channels. Multiple German units subsequently treated that grid square as secure, fundamentally altering their search patterns and resource allocation. A single successful deception had created a cascade effect through enemy operational planning. The liberation brought immediate consequences. All 43 survivors required hospitalization. Malnutrition, frostbite, and infection were universal. McKinley himself had lost 18 pounds in 6 days and suffered severe frostbite on both hands that required partial amputation of 3 fingers. Injuries sustained during the 90-minute operation to create the deception that saved everyone's life. Captain Chen was evacuated to England for treatment of exhaustion and pneumonia. Before departure, he submitted a formal recommendation that Corporal McKinley receive the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinarily heroic action that saved 43 American soldiers through innovative tactical deception under extreme combat conditions. The recommendation was approved in March 1945. McKinley received the medal at a field ceremony in Germany, though by that point the war had moved far beyond the Ardennes forest where his desperate gamble had succeeded. The longer-term legacy proved more complex. McKinley's deception became classified almost immediately. U.S. Army Medical Corps leadership recognized that the technique could be replicated, but wanted to control how the knowledge was disseminated. The concern was twofold. First, that premature publicity would alert enemy forces to the possibility of blood-based tactical deception compromising future operations. Second, that medical personnel might waste precious blood resources attempting complex deceptions without understanding the specific conditions that made McKinley's operation successful. The technique was formally codified in classified medical training documents circulated in February 1945 under the designation Tactical Medical Deception Protocol 7, Blood Evidence Manipulation for Enemy Search Pattern Disruption. The protocol was taught to senior combat medics in specialized training programs, but was never widely disseminated during World War II. The technique's effectiveness depended on surprise and on enemy forces not anticipating that American medical personnel would deliberately create false evidence using actual blood resources. McKinley returned to Russell Springs, Kansas, in July 1945, after victory in Europe. He worked as a civilian emergency medical technician for 33 years, training new medics and rarely discussing his wartime service. When asked about his military experience, he typically responded that he had done medical work in Europe. He did not attend reunions. He did not seek publicity. He considered himself simply a medic who had done what was necessary under impossible circumstances. The soldiers he saved remained in contact. Private Bennett became a teacher in Ohio and named his first son James after McKinley. Captain Chen completed medical school after the war and established a trauma surgery practice in San Francisco, later testifying before Congress about combat medical innovations during World War II, though he never publicly identified the specific operation that had saved his life. Sergeant Murphy became a police officer in Massachusetts and trained other officers in tactical deception techniques adapted from his experience in the Ardennes. The story remained largely classified until 1982, when the Army Medical Department declassified World War II tactical medical documents as part of historical preservation efforts. Researchers discovered McKinley's after-action report and Captain Chen's recommendation for his Distinguished Service Cross. The story appeared in specialized military medical journals, but received little broader attention. It was considered an interesting historical footnote rather than a transformative example of combat innovation. McKinley died in 1998 at age 78. His obituary in the Russell Springs newspaper mentioned his military service, but did not detail his actions in Belgium. His Distinguished Service Cross was donated to the Army Medical Department Museum at Fort Sam Houston, where it remains on display with a small placard explaining that he had saved numerous wounded soldiers through innovative medical procedures during the Battle of the Bulge. The broader implications became clear only in retrospective analysis. McKinley's deception demonstrated that tactical innovation under extreme pressure could exploit enemy doctrinal assumptions more effectively than direct resistance. The Wehrmacht's systematic thoroughness, normally an enormous advantage, became a vulnerability when Americans created evidence that satisfied German search protocols while redirecting attention away from actual positions. The deception worked not because German soldiers were incompetent, but because they were professionals who followed doctrine designed to handle conventional military problems. McKinley had created an unconventional problem for which Wehrmacht training provided no adequate response framework. Modern military medical doctrine now includes deception operations as a recognized component of combat medical planning, though the specific techniques remain classified. The fundamental principle McKinley demonstrated, that limited resources applied with creativity can achieve effects disproportionate to their apparent value, has become central to contemporary military medical thinking, particularly in special operations contexts, where medical personnel frequently operate in hostile environments with minimal support. The story of how a 24-year-old medic from Kansas saved 43 lives using 2 liters of blood, 90 minutes of preparation, and one desperate gamble remains largely unknown outside military medical circles. But for the men who survived 6 days beneath the frozen Ardennes while German patrols searched the wrong bunker 40 meters away, McKinley's dumb blood trick represented something more fundamental than tactical deception. It represented proof that ordinary Americans, confronted with impossible situations, possess the capacity for extraordinary innovation. That when training fails and doctrine provides no answers, human ingenuity remains the ultimate resource, and that sometimes the most sophisticated victory is achieved not through overwhelming force, but through a simple idea executed with desperate courage in darkness beneath a frozen forest while armies search for shadows. If this incredible story of innovation under impossible pressure moved you, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of American courage during World War II. Comment below, what would you have done in Corporal McKinley's situation? Share your thoughts and let's honor these heroes together. Hit that notification bell. History is worth remembering.